Captain Holly Ace had always prided herself on being the kind of pilot who could thread a cargo hauler through an asteroid field blindfolded while eating a sandwich. What she hadn't planned on was threading said hauler through the business end of an ion storm that decided to show up 3 hours early to the party. "Oh, fantastic," she muttered, wrestling with controls that seemed determined to interpret every command as a suggestion rather than an order. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. The stellar drifter groaned around her, its hull singing an increasingly frantic tune as charged particles hammered the shields like cosmic hail. Because a routine supply run to Kepler 438b was definitely missing some excitement. The storm had materialized out of nowhere, which would have been impressive if it weren't currently trying to turn her ship into the galaxy's most expensive firework display. Holly's instruments were having what could generously be called a nervous breakdown, displaying readings that suggested she was simultaneously moving at light speed and sitting perfectly still in 3 different dimensions. Warning: hull integrity at 60%, the ship's AI announced, with the same helpful tone it might use to remind her she was out of coffee. Recommend immediate course correction. Oh, really? Course correction? Holly yanked the controls hard to port, feeling the ship shudder like a wet dog. Here I was, planning to fly directly into the pretty purple lightning because I thought it might be fun. The next bolt of charged energy struck the drifter's starboard engine with all the subtlety of an angry god, and suddenly Holly was no longer flying so much as participating in what physicists might call a controlled crash. Or rather, an uncontrolled crash with delusions of being controlled. The forest canopy of Kepler 438b rushed up to meet her with unseemly enthusiasm. Holly had approximately 3 seconds to reflect on how the trees looked surprisingly healthy for a planet that was supposed to be mostly mining operations, and then the drifter decided to become intimately acquainted with several dozen of them. Metal screamed, trees cracked. Physics had a field day. When the universe stopped rearranging itself around her, Holly found herself hanging upside down in her pilot's chair, held in place by a harness that had apparently decided this was a perfectly reasonable way to end a Tuesday. Blood was running toward her hairline in a way that suggested gravity was still working, which was something, she supposed. "Status report," she croaked, then realized she was talking to a control panel that was now displaying what appeared to be abstract art made of sparks. The silence that answered her was the kind of profound quiet that suggested her ship's AI had either died or was seriously reconsidering its career choices. Holly managed to unhook herself from the harness and tumbled to what used to be the ceiling with all the grace of a sack of potatoes. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been personally insulted by the crash, but she could move, which put her ahead of the stellar drifter in the still functional category. The emergency hatch opened with a wheeze of escaping atmosphere, and Holly stumbled out into alien daylight that was just a little too blue and a little too bright. The forest around her looked like something from a nature documentary. If nature documentaries featured trees that were roughly the size of skyscrapers and had bark that seemed to shimmer with an oily rainbow sheen. "Well," she said to no one in particular, because there was definitely no one in particular around to hear her. "This is either going to be a really interesting survival story or a really short one." She'd made it perhaps 50 meters from her crashed ship, taking inventory of what supplies she could salvage from the scattered cargo, when she heard it. A sound that made every primitive instinct in her human brain sit up and start screaming warnings about being very, very far from the top of the food chain. It was a howl, low and mournful, but with an undertone that suggested whatever was making it had teeth. Lots of teeth. Big teeth. Teeth that had opinions about the local wildlife and weren't shy about expressing them. Holly had studied xenobiology before her career took a hard left turn into cargo hauling, and she recognized the sound of a predator in distress. Not injured distress, which would have been bad enough, but grief distress, which was somehow worse because it meant she was dealing with something smart enough to mourn. Following the sound was exactly the kind of decision that got people killed in horror movies, but Holly had never been particularly good at making sensible decisions. It was why she was flying cargo runs to the edge of civilized space instead of teaching xenobiology at some comfortable university. The howling led her through the forest for nearly 20 minutes, past trees that seemed to lean in to watch her pass, and undergrowth that rustled with things that were probably just wind, but probably weren't. The blue sunlight filtered down through the canopy in shifting patterns that made everything look like it was underwater, and Holly was starting to think she'd made a terrible mistake when she found them. The clearing looked like a battlefield. The ground was torn up, scarred with claw marks that could have been made by industrial equipment if industrial equipment came with organic components, and a really bad attitude. There were patches of what might have been blood, though it was a color that Holly's brain kept insisting was wrong, too dark and too iridescent. At the center of the devastation lay the Alpha. Holly had never seen an umbral stalker in person, but she recognized the species from her xenobiology training. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small shuttle, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light and make the air around it seem darker. Its eyes, now closed, would have glowed amber when it was alive. The intelligence ratings for umbral stalkers were classified, but Holly had read enough between the lines to know they were smart. Dangerously smart. What made the scene heartbreaking wasn't the dead Alpha, though. It was the three smaller shapes huddled around it. The cubs were roughly the size of earth ponies, their fur the same light-absorbing black as their fallen leader. They weren't howling anymore. Instead, they were making soft, keening sounds that spoke of loss in a language that needed no translation. One of them, the smallest, was gently nosing at the Alpha's still form as if trying to wake it up. Holly's xenobiology training kicked in, overriding the part of her brain that was screaming about being in close proximity to apex predators. These cubs were juveniles, probably not old enough to hunt effectively on their own. Without their Alpha, they were essentially orphans in a hostile ecosystem. The fact that they wouldn't leave their leader's side, despite probably being hungry and definitely being vulnerable, spoke to a level of loyalty and emotional intelligence that made Holly's chest tighten. She was so focused on the cubs that she almost missed the tracks. The marks in the soft earth around the clearing weren't just from the battle. There were boot prints, human boot prints, mixed with paw prints that were similar to the umbral stalkers, but somehow wrong. Too symmetrical, too perfect. Like someone had designed them rather than evolved them. Holly crouched down, her pilot's instincts overriding her xenobiologist training. She'd learned to read signs during her military service, back when she'd worn a different uniform and had different responsibilities. These tracks told a story she didn't like. The Alpha hadn't died in a territorial dispute with another pack. It had been killed by something that walked on two legs and brought engineered backup. "What the hell happened here?" she whispered. The largest of the three cubs turned its head toward her, amber eyes locking onto hers with an intelligence that was frankly unnerving. It didn't growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it made a soft sound that could have been a question or a warning. The other two cubs looked up as well, their heads tilting in perfect synchronization as they studied this strange, bipedal intruder. Holly remained perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was close enough to see the individual whiskers on their faces, close enough to notice that their amber eyes had flecks of silver that seemed to shift and dance in the filtered sunlight. They were beautiful and terrifying in the way that only apex predators could be. The smallest cub, the one that had been trying to wake its alpha, took a tentative step toward Holly. Its siblings immediately flanked it, not aggressively, but in a protective formation that spoke of pack instincts and tactical thinking. "Easy there, kids," Holly said softly, keeping her voice low and non-threatening. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just a lost pilot, trying to figure out what happened to your family." The cubs exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey an entire conversation. Holly had the distinct impression that they understood more of what she'd said than should have been possible, given that they belonged to completely different species with no shared evolutionary history. Then the smallest cub did something that made Holly's heart skip. It sat down and looked directly at her crashed ship, visible through the trees, then back at her, then at the alpha's body, then back at her again. "Oh, you clever little things," Holly breathed. "You know exactly what I am, don't you? And you know I didn't do this." The largest cub made another soft sound, this one definitely a question, and Holly realized with a start that they were trying to communicate with her. Not just acknowledging her presence, but actually attempting some form of dialogue. Her crashed ship was between them, and what her mental map suggested was the nearest water source. The cubs were grieving, confused, and probably getting dehydrated. Meanwhile, she was stranded with limited supplies and no working communications, in territory that apparently attracted the kind of people who left engineered predator tracks and dead alphas. Holly looked at the three cubs, who were looking back at her with expressions that managed to be both hopeful and heartbreaking, and made yet another decision that her rational mind would probably regret. "All right," she said, settling into a cross-legged position that put her at roughly eye level with the cubs. "I don't know what happened to your alpha, but I've got a pretty good idea it wasn't natural. And since my ship is currently more decorative than functional, it looks like we're all stuck here together." The cubs tilted their heads in unison again, and Holly couldn't shake the feeling that they understood every word she'd said. "The way I see it, we've got two options. We can sit here and wait for whatever killed your pack leader to come back and finish the job, or we can figure out how to work together and maybe all survive this mess." She reached slowly into her jacket and pulled out one of her emergency ration bars, holding it up where the cubs could see it. Their nostrils flared as they caught the scent, and Holly saw hunger flicker in their amber eyes for just a moment before grief reasserted itself. They were starving, but they weren't eating. Classic signs of depression and disrupted pack hierarchy in social predators. Without their alpha, they didn't know who was supposed to hunt, who was supposed to lead, or even whether they were supposed to survive. Holly broke off a piece of the ration bar and held it out toward the smallest cub, the one who had first approached her. "I know this isn't what you usually eat, but it's protein, and protein is protein when you're hungry enough." The cub stared at the offered food, then at Holly, then at its siblings. The internal debate was written clearly across its expressive face. Accept help from an alien, or maintain the grief-stricken fast that was slowly killing them all. Hunger won. The smallest cub crept forward and delicately took the piece of ration bar from Holly's fingers, with teeth that could have easily removed her hand if it had chosen to. It chewed thoughtfully, its expression suggesting it had opinions about human military rations, none of them particularly flattering. But it swallowed. And that, Holly realized as she watched the other two cubs edge closer, was how she accidentally became the temporary alpha of a pack of alien apex predators on a planet that was apparently home to some very unpleasant people with very poor intentions. "Well," she said, breaking off more pieces of her ration bar, as 3 pairs of amber eyes watched her every movement. "This is either going to be the start of a beautiful friendship or the most elaborate way anyone has ever committed suicide." The cubs, perhaps wisely, reserved judgment. Over the next 2 days, Holly learned several important things about umbral stalkers that hadn't been covered in her xenobiology textbooks. First, they were apparently capable of holding grudges against inanimate objects, as evidenced by the way the largest cub kept glaring at her crashed ship, like it had personally insulted his ancestors. Second, they had a sense of humor, which she discovered when the middle cub, the one she'd started thinking of as the cautious one, deliberately led her into a patch of what turned out to be alien poison ivy, then made a sound that was suspiciously like laughter when she started itching. Third, and most importantly, they were a lot smarter than anyone had given them credit for. "Okay, so let me get this straight," Holly said, sitting cross-legged in the clearing, while the 3 cubs arranged themselves in a semicircle around her, like students attending the galaxy's strangest lecture. "You understand that my ship is broken. You understand that I'm stuck here. And you're trying to tell me that the thing that killed your alpha wasn't another umbral stalker pack." The largest cub, who Holly had dubbed Big Guy for lack of a better name, made a series of low, rumbling sounds while using his claws to scratch marks in the dirt. The marks looked suspiciously like the boot prints Holly had found earlier. "Yeah, I saw those too," Holly said grimly. "Humans! Or something human-shaped anyway. The question is, what were they doing in your territory? And why did they kill your alpha?" The smallest cub, Little Bit, because Holly's naming creativity was apparently limited by stress and dehydration, chirped something that sounded almost like words. Not human words, obviously, but definitely structured communication rather than just animal sounds. Holly had been a xenobiologist long enough to recognize intelligence when she saw it, and what she was seeing here was making her revise every assumption she'd ever had about umbral stalkers. These weren't just smart predators. They were showing signs of genuine sapience. Tool use, complex communication, abstract thinking, and emotional depth that went well beyond simple pack bonding. Which raised the uncomfortable question of why the Terran Mining Consortium had listed Kepler 438b as containing only non-sapient megafauna in their environmental impact reports. Holly's emergency rations were running low, and the cubs' condition was improving but still worrying. They'd started accepting food from her, but they were clearly not thriving on a diet of human military rations. She needed to find them proper prey, which meant figuring out how to hunt on an alien world without becoming someone else's dinner in the process. The cautious cub, who Holly had started calling Watchful, seemed to understand her dilemma. It kept making soft sounds and gesturing with its muzzle toward different parts of the forest, as if trying to communicate something about local wildlife. "You want to show me something, don't you?" Holly said, studying Watchful's body language. The cub's ears were pricked forward, tail held high, and it kept taking a few steps in one direction before looking back at her expectantly. Holly's military training warred with her common sense. Following apex predators deeper into unknown territory was exactly the kind of decision that got explorers turned into cautionary tales. On the other hand, staying put with dwindling supplies while waiting for whoever had killed the cub's alpha to come back wasn't exactly a recipe for long-term survival either. "All right," she said, standing up and checking her sidearm. "But if this is some elaborate way of leading me to your cousins for dinner, I'm going to be very disappointed in our budding friendship." The cubs exchanged those meaningful glances again, and Holly was starting to think their silent communication was far more sophisticated than simple body language. They moved through the forest with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive practice and natural teamwork. What they showed her made her stomach clench with a mixture of understanding and dread. It was another clearing, smaller than the one where they'd found the alpha's body, but marked with the same signs of violence. The ground was scorched in places, as if by energy weapons, and there were more of those two perfect paw prints mixed with human boot tracks. But what made Holly's blood run cold were the bones. They weren't umbral stalker bones. They were too small, too delicate, and they belonged to creatures that Holly didn't recognize. Local prey species, most likely, but arranged in a way that spoke of systematic hunting rather than natural predation. "They were testing something," Holly breathed, crouching down to examine the evidence. "Using your territory as a hunting ground for... what? Bioengineered predators?" Big Guy made a low, angry sound and pawed at something half buried in the dirt. When Holly brushed away the soil, she found a piece of metal that looked suspiciously like part of a control collar. The pieces were starting to fit together, and Holly didn't like the picture they were forming. Someone had been using engineered predators to clear out the local ecosystem, probably as a precursor to mining operations. The umbral stalker pack had been in the way, so they'd been eliminated. The cubs had only survived because they'd been hidden away when the attack happened, probably on their alpha's orders. "Your pack leader knew this was coming, didn't he?" Holly asked softly. "That's why he made his last stand here, away from wherever you three were hiding. He was trying to protect you." Little Bit made a sound that was unmistakably a sob, and Holly felt her heart break a little more. These creatures weren't just intelligent. They were capable of sacrifice, loyalty, and grief on a level that put most humans to shame. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sound of approaching aircraft. The cubs heard it first, their heads snapping up in perfect unison as their ears swiveled to track the noise. Holly's military instincts kicked in, and she motioned for the cubs to follow her into the cover of the larger trees. 3 corporate shuttles came into view, flying in tight formation and bearing the logo of Kepler Mining Solutions, a subsidiary of the Terran Mining Consortium that specialized in environmental preparation for extraction operations. Holly's mouth went dry as she recognized the euphemism environmental preparation, otherwise known as killing everything that might object to having its home strip-mined. The shuttles circled the area where Holly's ship had crashed, their sensors no doubt picking up the stellar drifter's signature. One of them landed while the other 2 maintained overwatch, and Holly watched through the trees as a squad of armed figures emerged. They weren't wearing standard corporate security gear. These were military-grade combat suits, with modifications that looked suspiciously like the kind of equipment used for hunting dangerous wildlife. Each figure carried weapons that Holly recognized as pulse rifles, illegal for civilian use, but perfect for taking down large, aggressive fauna. Or inconvenient cargo pilots who might have witnessed something they shouldn't have. "Looking for survivors?" one of the figures called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still forest air. "Negative," came the reply from what was obviously the squad leader. "Orders are to verify the crash was fatal and clean up any loose ends. The pilot was flagged as a potential problem after that incident at the Proxima facility." Holly's blood turned to ice. The Proxima facility had been her last legitimate cargo run before switching to freelance work, and she'd reported what looked like illegal bioweapons research to the Environmental Council. The report had been buried, her military record had been mysteriously flagged, and she'd found herself blacklisted from respectable shipping companies. Apparently, someone had decided that blacklisting wasn't enough. "Thermal scans show the crash site is cold," another voice reported. "No life signs in the immediate area. But there are some unusual energy readings deeper in the forest." "Probably just local wildlife," the squad leader said dismissively. "The stalker pack in this area was neutralized 3 days ago. Nothing left but scavengers and small prey." Holly felt Big Guy tense beside her, a low growl building in his throat. She placed a gentle hand on his massive head, trying to project calm, while her own anger built to a slow boil. These people had murdered the cub's family, and were now talking about it like it was routine pest control. "Sir," one of the other figures said, "are you sure it's wise to leave this area unsecured? The Environmental Council has been asking questions about our operations here." "The Environmental Council can ask all the questions they want," the squad leader replied with audible contempt. "By the time they get through the bureaucracy, this site will be a fully operational mining complex. The board has already approved Phase 2 of the Ecosystem Modification Project." Ecosystem modification. Holly had heard that term before, in classified briefings that made her skin crawl. It was corporate speak for using bioengineered species to systematically eliminate native wildlife, clearing the way for industrial development without the messy legal complications of environmental protection laws. The fact that the native wildlife in this case included sapient beings was apparently just a minor detail. The squad spent another 20 minutes documenting the crash site and collecting samples from the stellar drifter's wreckage. Holly watched them work with the sick fascination of someone witnessing a crime in progress, memorizing faces and equipment configurations in case she somehow survived to testify later. When the shuttles finally departed, Holly and the cubs remained hidden for another hour, waiting to make sure the corporate team wasn't coming back. Only when the forest had returned to its normal sounds did Holly finally allow herself to breathe. "Well," she said quietly, looking at the 3 cubs who had witnessed their family's murderers casually discussing their next atrocity, "I think we can safely say that calling for rescue is off the table." Big Guy made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been a promise of violence. Given what they'd just overheard, Holly was hoping for a little of both. The cubs were no longer just orphaned predators in need of help. They were witnesses to genocide, and Holly was apparently the only thing standing between them and the people who wanted to finish what they'd started. "All right, kids," she said, checking her weapon and taking inventory of her remaining supplies. "Looks like we're going to have to get creative about this whole survival thing. Because I've got news for those corporate bastards. They picked the wrong pilot to mess with." Little Bit chirped something that sounded almost like a question, tilting her head in that endearing way that made Holly's heart clench. "What am I going to do?" Holly translated, smiling grimly. "I'm going to teach you 3 how to be the most dangerous pack on this planet. And then we're going to make sure everyone in the galaxy knows exactly what Kepler Mining Solutions does to innocent families." The cubs exchanged those meaningful looks again, and this time Holly was sure she saw something like approval in their amber eyes. It was going to be a very interesting few days. Teaching apex predators how to hunt should have been like teaching fish how to swim. But Holly quickly discovered that grief and trauma had a way of scrambling even the most basic instincts. The cubs knew how to hunt in theory. Their bodies were perfectly designed killing machines. But they'd lost the confidence and coordination that came from having a pack leader to follow. "Okay, think of me as your very inadequate substitute alpha," Holly said, crouched beside a stream where something that looked like a cross between a deer and a small dinosaur was drinking. "I know I don't have claws or fangs or any of the traditional qualifications, but I do have opposable thumbs and a really bad attitude toward people who hurt my friends." Big Guy made a sound that Holly had learned meant something like dubious but willing to try, while Watchful studied the prey animal with the intensity of a student cramming for finals. Little Bit, meanwhile, had discovered that she could use her claws to strip bark from trees, which wasn't immediately useful for hunting, but showed promising tool use development. The first few attempts at coordinated hunting were disasters that would have been funny if they weren't so heartbreaking. The cubs kept looking to Holly for guidance she couldn't provide, their natural pack tactics falling apart without the alpha's directing presence. Meanwhile, Holly tried to apply human military strategy to alien predators, and mostly succeeded in confusing everyone involved. "No, no, Big Guy. You can't just charge straight at everything," Holly whispered as their third potential meal bounded away into the forest. "This isn't a military assault, it's a precision operation. You need finesse." Big Guy gave her a look that clearly said, "You try catching something with finesse when you're the size of a small shuttle." And Holly had to admit he had a point. It was Little Bit who finally figured it out. The smallest cub had been watching Holly's attempts to teach pack coordination with the kind of intense focus that usually preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Then, during their fourth failed hunt, she did something that made Holly's xenobiologist brain practically sing with excitement. She started using primitive sign language. Not human sign language, obviously, but a system of claw gestures and tail positions that allowed her to communicate hunting instructions to her siblings without making noise. Within minutes, Big Guy and Watchful had picked up the basic signals, and suddenly the cubs were moving like the coordinated team they were born to be. "You brilliant little genius," Holly breathed, watching as the cubs successfully brought down their first prey using their sister's improvised communication system. "You just invented tactical sign language because I'm too loud to hunt with." The cubs' success seemed to break something loose in their grief-stricken minds. Over the next day, they began displaying more of their natural behaviors, grooming each other, playing brief games that looked like combat training, and most importantly, treating Holly as a genuine pack member rather than just a temporary food source. It was during one of these play sessions that Holly made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been watching Watchful demonstrate what appeared to be a complex puzzle-solving exercise involving manipulating fallen branches into specific patterns. The behavior was clearly learned rather than instinctual, too complex and deliberate to be hardwired, which meant umbral stalkers had culture. They passed knowledge between generations through teaching and demonstration. "Show me what your alpha taught you," Holly said softly, settling into her cross-legged observation position. What the cubs showed her made her stomach drop into her boots. Working together with the kind of seamless coordination that spoke of extensive practice, the three cubs began arranging rocks and sticks into a three-dimensional map of their territory. The level of spatial reasoning and abstract thinking required was staggering, but what made Holly's blood run cold was what the map revealed. The cubs' territory wasn't random. It was strategically positioned to control access to the largest freshwater source in the region, the richest hunting grounds, and, most importantly, the network of caves that provided shelter from the planet's seasonal storms. Any mining operation that wanted to establish a permanent presence would need to control these exact resources. The Terran Mining Consortium hadn't just randomly decided to eliminate a pack of predators. They'd targeted the umbral stalkers specifically because the Cubs family controlled territory that was essential for large-scale industrial operations. "It was never about pest control," Holly whispered, staring at the Cubs' makeshift map. "It was about strategic resource acquisition." Big Guy made a low, questioning sound, and Holly realized he was asking her to add to their map. She picked up a stick and began sketching in the locations where they'd found evidence of the corporate team's activities, her hands shaking with anger as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The Terran Mining Consortium had been systematically eliminating intelligent native species and replacing them with controllable bioengineered alternatives. The modified predators Holly had seen evidence of weren't just for clearing out wildlife, they were designed to hold territory for the corporation, preventing any surviving natives from reclaiming their ancestral lands. "Your people weren't just murdered," Holly said, her voice tight with fury. "They were victims of corporate colonialism on a scale that makes the old Earth resource wars look like playground disputes." The Cubs seemed to understand the gravity of what she was telling them. Their ears flattened, and Little Bit made a sound that was pure, concentrated hatred. A sound that no creature should have been capable of making at such a young age. Holly's hands clenched into fists as she stared at the evidence of genocide laid out in rocks and sticks. She'd seen corporate overreach before, had even been blacklisted for trying to expose it. But this was different. This was systematic extinction for profit, carried out against beings who were clearly sapient, clearly capable of art and culture and love. "They picked the wrong species to mess with," she said quietly, meeting each Cub's amber gaze in turn. "And they definitely picked the wrong human to leave alive to witness it." The Cubs tilted their heads in that synchronized way that had become familiar, and Holly could practically see the questions forming behind their intelligent eyes. "What are we going to do about it?" she translated, allowing a predatory smile to cross her face. "We're going to give them a demonstration of what happens when you underestimate the intelligence of your victims." She stood up, her mind already working through the tactical possibilities. The corporate team would be back, probably with the full bioengineered hunting pack this time. They'd expect to find a crashed pilot's body and 3 traumatized, leaderless Cubs. Instead, they were going to encounter something that had never existed before in the galaxy's recorded history. A human umbral stalker pack with a very personal grudge and absolutely nothing left to lose. "Time to see how well those corporate mercenaries handle prey that hunts back," Holly said, and was gratified to see her 3 pack mates bare their fangs, in what could only be described as anticipatory grins. The corporate strike team returned 2 days later, with 3 shuttles instead of 1, and what Holly's military-trained eye immediately recognized as overkill. Through her salvaged binoculars, she counted 12 armed operatives plus at least 6 of the bioengineered hybrid stalkers, creatures that looked like someone had taken the basic umbral stalker template and decided it needed more teeth, more claws, and considerably less brain. "Look at that," Holly murmured to Big Guy, who was crouched beside her on the ridge overlooking her crash site. "They brought knockoff versions of you." "I'm almost insulted on your behalf." Big Guy studied the bioengineered creatures with the kind of professional interest that one apex predator reserves for evaluating another. His assessment, conveyed through a series of dismissive snorts, seemed to be that the corporate team's hunting pack was all brawn and no brains. "My thoughts, exactly," Holly agreed. "Time to show them why evolution beats engineering every single time." The Cubs had spent the past 2 days preparing for this moment with the kind of methodical planning that would have impressed a military strategist. Using their newfound tactical sign language and Holly's human understanding of asymmetric warfare, they'd turned the forest around the crash site into a maze of carefully positioned traps and ambush points. Holly's part in the plan was simple: be the bait. Her job was to appear helpless and alone, drawing the strike team away from their shuttles and into the kill zone the Cubs had prepared. It wasn't the kind of plan that prioritized her personal safety, but then again, none of them were likely to survive if the corporate team succeeded in covering up their genocide. She activated her emergency beacon, a risky move that would draw the strike team directly to her, but also broadcast her location to any legitimate rescue operations that might be monitoring the area. If they were going to make a stand, it might as well be one that left evidence. The corporate team moved with professional efficiency, their bioengineered hunters ranging ahead, while the human operatives followed in tactical formation. Holly had to admit they were good at their jobs, which was unfortunate since their job appeared to be murdering inconvenient witnesses. "Unknown subject, identify yourself," the strike team leader called out as they approached Holly's position near the crashed stellar drifter. "We're here to conduct rescue operations." "Rescue operations?" Holly stepped out from behind her ship's twisted hull, hands visible but close to her sidearm. "That's funny, because your rescue team is carrying enough firepower to level a small city." The strike team leader's helmet visor was down, but Holly could practically feel his assessment of her as a threat. Behind him, the bioengineered stalkers prowled restlessly, their movements too mechanical to be natural. "Captain Holly," the leader said, and Holly's blood chilled at the casual use of her name. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble with your reports to the Environmental Council. Time to clean up some loose ends." "Loose ends?" Holly laughed, the sound sharp and dangerous in the forest air. "Is that what you're calling the systematic murder of sapient beings now?" "The local fauna has been reclassified as non-sapient based on updated behavioral assessments," came the cold reply. "Eliminating pest species is well within corporate operational parameters." That was when Little Bit struck. The smallest cub dropped from the canopy directly onto one of the bioengineered creatures, her claws finding the weak points in its artificial musculature with surgical precision. The hybrid went down with a mechanical shriek that sounded nothing like the organic calls of real umbral stalkers. "What the?" the strike team leader began, but his words were cut off as Big Guy and Watchful emerged from concealment on either side of the formation, moving with the fluid coordination they'd developed over their days of training. The corporate operatives were good, but they'd prepared to fight individual predators, not a coordinated pack with tactical intelligence. Holly's cubs flowed around their formation like water, striking at weak points and vanishing before the humans could bring their superior firepower to bear. Holly drew her sidearm and put 3-round center mass into the strike team leader, her military training taking over as the forest erupted into chaos around her. The man's armor absorbed most of the impact, but it was enough to stagger him and disrupt his team's coordination. "Engage! Engage!" someone was shouting over the team's comm system. "Multiple hostiles! Unknown capabilities." The bioengineered creatures tried to respond to the attack, but they'd been designed to hunt simple prey, not to coordinate against intelligent opposition. Little Bit had already taken down 2 of them using tactics that exploited their mechanical predictability, while Big Guy was systematically dismantling a 3rd with the kind of methodical violence that suggested he'd been looking forward to this moment. Watchful, meanwhile, had done something that made Holly's heart soar with pride. The cautious cub had figured out how to operate Holly's crashed ship's emergency communication array. While the battle raged around them, Watchful was broadcasting everything. The corporate team's admission of genocide, the evidence of bioengineered weapons, the systematic elimination of sapient beings for corporate profit. "Signals going out on all emergency frequencies," Holly called out as she ducked behind cover, her weapon tracking another corporate operative. "Environmental Council, Galactic Trade Commission, even the news networks. Your little cover-up just became front-page news across 6-star systems." The strike team leader's response was a stream of profanity that would have made a cargo hauler blush, followed by orders to eliminate all witnesses immediately. But it was too late. The Cubs had turned the corporate team's own tactics against them, using superior intelligence and coordination to systematically dismantle what should have been an overwhelming force. Within minutes, half the strike team was down. Their bioengineered hunters were scrap metal and synthetic biology, and the survivors were calling for immediate extraction. As the corporate shuttles lifted off in disorganized retreat, Holly found herself surrounded by 3 very satisfied-looking Cubs and a communication array that was still broadcasting evidence of corporate genocide to anyone in the galaxy willing to listen. "Well," she said, checking her weapon and surveying the battlefield, "I think that went better than expected." Little Bit chirped something that sounded suspiciously like agreement, while Big Guy and Watchful began the grim task of examining the fallen bioengineered creatures. Their expressions suggested they were committing every detail to memory, learning everything they could about their artificial cousins. 3 hours later, when the Environmental Council's emergency response team arrived, they found a crashed cargo pilot, 3 highly intelligent Umbral stalker Cubs, and enough evidence of corporate malfeasance to trigger the largest investigation in galactic history. Holly was offered a full pardon for her previous troublemaking and a position as the Cubs' official guardian and the planet's xenobiological protection coordinator. The Cubs, for their part, seemed perfectly content to have their territory designated as a protected preserve, especially when it came with regular deliveries of human-style ration bars. "So, what do we call this arrangement?" the Environmental Council representative asked, as Holly watched her 3 packmates demonstrate their tactical sign language for a fascinated team of xenolinguists. Holly smiled, scratching Little Bit behind the ears as the cub leaned into her touch. "I think family covers it pretty well. And if sometimes the local mining companies reported strange sightings of human stalker patrols in the deep forest, well, that was probably just their imagination. After all, who would believe that the galaxy's most effective conservation team consisted of 1 stubborn cargo pilot and 3 Cubs who'd learned that the best way to honor their fallen alpha was to make sure no other family ever suffered the same loss? The forest, for its part, had never been safer.